stood there at my own retirement party in the house I built from nothing and told me it was time to think about transitioning. That was the word she used. Transitioning. Like I was a business being handed over to new management. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anyone out. I just looked at her. This woman my son had brought into our lives 14 months ago. And I nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone says something so far outside the bounds of decency that your brain needs a full second to confirm it actually happened. My name is not important. What I am is a retired civil engineer, 63 years old, widower for 4 years, owner of a home I designed and built on a half-acre lot outside Knoxville, Tennessee. I raised one son in that house. I buried my wife from that house. I was not, under any circumstances, transitioning out of it. But let me back up, because to understand what happened that evening, you need to understand what the 14 months before it looked like. My son. I'll call him my son, because that's what he is. That's the only role that matters in this story. Married a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law. She was 31. He was 34. They met at a conference in Nashville, were engaged within 7 months, married in a ceremony I funded almost entirely, at a venue she selected, with a guest list she curated, with a photographer whose day rate was more than I used to make in a week starting out. I didn't complain. I want to be clear about that. My wife, God rest her, always said the wedding belongs to the couple, not the parents. So I wrote the checks. I smiled in the photos. I danced with my daughter-in-law at the reception while my son watched from the head table with a glass of bourbon and a grin I hadn't seen on his face since he was 12 years old, and I took him fishing at Norris Lake. I thought, this is good. He's happy. That's enough. I was wrong about what enough means to some people. The first sign was small. They were renting an apartment in Chattanooga, 40 minutes from me. 3 months after the wedding, my daughter-in-law started making comments about the drive. Not complaints exactly, she was too smart for that. More like observations. It's just so far when something comes up. Or, I always worry about you out here alone, with the property being so large. I live on half an acre, with a 2-car garage and a garden shed. But I let it pass. She was new to the family. People say awkward things when they're finding their footing. Then came the suggestion, about 6 months in, that I might want to think about right-sizing. She had read an article, she said, about older homeowners liquidating equity early instead of waiting. The timing, she explained, was everything in real estate. She had a friend, a realtor, who would love to walk through and give me a free assessment. I told her I wasn't interested in an assessment. She told me to just think about it. I told her I had thought about it. No, thank you. My son didn't say anything. He refilled his coffee and looked out the window at my backyard, at the oak tree I planted the year he was born, now 4 stories tall and full and permanent. I should have said something then. To him, specifically. I didn't. The retirement party was my idea. 32 years in civil engineering, the last 12 as a project director for the state. I wanted to market properly, not a big production, just people who mattered. I invited 27 people, colleagues, neighbors, a few old friends, my son and daughter-in-law. I catered it myself more or less. My neighbor Pauline helped with the food. I strung lights in the backyard. It was a Tuesday evening in October and the weather was perfect. Cool and clear. The oak tree just beginning to turn. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. People I'd worked with for decades standing in my kitchen, telling stories I hadn't thought about in years. My old supervisor, who is 78 and still sharp as a tack, stood at the kitchen island for an hour straight and held court, and I laughed harder than I had in months. My daughter-in-law arrived with my son at 7, an hour after the party started. She was dressed impeccably, as always. She kissed my cheek, handed me a bottle of wine I would never have bought for myself, and immediately began a conversation with a woman she had never met about the real estate market in East Tennessee. I noticed it, but I didn't dwell on it. The moment came around 9 o'clock. Most guests had eaten. The pace had slowed. My son was talking to someone near the fire pit. My daughter-in-law found me in the kitchen and asked if we could talk privately for a moment. We stepped into my study, the room where I have my drafting table, my bookshelves, the framed photograph of the overpass I designed in 1998 that I am still proud of. She closed the door. She said, "I want to talk to you about the house." I said, "All right." She said she and my son had been talking. And she was very careful with the word talking. Very deliberate, like it was load-bearing. And they felt that with my retirement, with me being alone out here, it might be the right time for me to think about transitioning into something more manageable. A condo, perhaps. Or one of those nice 55-plus communities outside of town. I looked at her. She said they had spoken to her realtor friend. Informally, just to get a sense, and the house in this market could net me somewhere between $400,000 and $430,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage, which she somehow knew the approximate balance of, I would clear around $310,000. Enough, she said, for a very comfortable condo purchase and a healthy cushion. I said, "You looked into this?" She said, "We just wanted to be prepared." I said, "And my son asked you to have this conversation." She paused. She said, "We discussed it together." I want to tell you what that pause felt like. It felt like the floor shifting. Not because I was surprised she was capable of this. I had seen enough of who she was by then to not be entirely surprised. What shifted was the understanding that my son had sat across from this woman at some point. Maybe at their kitchen table, maybe in bed at night, and had said, "Yes, okay, you talk to him. You do it." And then he had come to my party and stood in my backyard by the fire I built and let her walk me into my own study, alone. I said, "This conversation is over." She said, "I'm just trying to help you think clearly about." I said, "I know exactly what you're doing, and I want you to leave my study." She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as recalibrating. Like she was adjusting a plan. She said very quietly, "You know this house is too big for one person." I opened the door. I did not say anything to my son that night. He came to find me 20 minutes later, when the party was still going, and he looked at my face, and he knew something had happened. He asked if everything was okay. I told him yes, enjoy the party. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, she means well. She means well." Those 3 words told me everything I needed to know. I slept on it. 2 nights, actually. I have learned in 63 years that the decisions you make in the first 24 hours after being ambushed are the decisions you regret. So, I slept on it. I went through my morning routine. I drank my coffee on the back porch and looked at my oak tree, and I thought very carefully about what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I was going to do. What I knew, my daughter-in-law had been building toward this for months. The comments about the drive. The right-sizing article. The realtor friend. This was not a spontaneous concern. This was a plan. What I didn't know. How much of it was hers, and how much of it was my son's. What I was going to do. Find out. And then act. I called my son on a Thursday morning and asked him to meet me for coffee. Just the 2 of us. He sounded slightly wary, which told me he'd been debriefed. He said, "Sure, Saturday morning?" I said, "Thursday morning. Today." He came. We sat in a diner I've been going to for 15 years. The same booth, the same waitress who knows I take my coffee black. I let him order. I let the coffee come, and then I set my cup down and I said, "Tell me, in your own words, what you're hoping happens with the house." He did that thing he's been doing since he was a teenager when I catch him in something. The little exhale. The look to the side. He said, "Dad, it's not like that." I said, "What is it like?" He said they were thinking about the future. He said the house was a lot for one person. He said his mother would have wanted me to. I stopped him there. I said, "Don't." He stopped. I said, "Your mother built that house with me. She picked every cabinet and every light fixture and every piece of tile in that kitchen. You don't get to use her name to make this argument. He looked like I'd struck him. Good. I said, I want you to answer one question honestly. Did you tell your wife the approximate balance of my mortgage? The pause before he answered was long enough to answer the question. He said, she asked about it. We were just trying to understand. I said, you shared my financial information with a woman I barely know in the context of a plan to remove me from my home. He said it wasn't like that. I said, then what was it like? Help me understand. He didn't have an answer that worked. He tried 2 or 3 formulations and they all collapsed under their own weight. I paid the check. I told him I loved him. I told him I needed some time. And I left. In the 2 weeks that followed, I did several things. First, I called my attorney, a woman I've worked with for a decade on property and estate matters, and I had a conversation about the legal protections on my home. She was thorough. She was also, when I explained the context, visibly concerned in the way attorneys allow themselves to be when they're off the record. She told me to document everything. I documented everything. Second, I reviewed every financial arrangement I had with my son over the years. Because I had the means and because I loved him, I had been generous. I was paying a portion of their car insurance. I had co-signed on an equipment loan he took out for a side business that never quite launched. I had been depositing a modest but regular amount into an account I'd set up when he was a teenager, which he still had access to, and which I had continued contributing to out of habit more than anything else. I stopped all of it, not in anger. I want to be clear about that. I did not make these changes in a rage or as punishment. I made them because I finally understood what the arrangement actually was. I had been quietly subsidizing a household that was, at least in part, planning to divest me of my home. That's not a relationship. That's an extraction. Third, I updated my estate documents. The house, the accounts, the property, all of it restructured. I called the attorney and I spent 4 hours in her office on a gray Friday afternoon, and when I left I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt like myself again. 3 weeks after the retirement party, my son called and asked if he and his wife could come by. He said they wanted to clear the air. I said yes. I set a date. I straightened up the house. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon. My daughter-in-law was in a softer register than usual, careful, measured, conciliatory. She had clearly prepared. She said she was sorry if she had overstepped, that her concern was genuine, that she could see how the conversation had landed wrong. It was a good performance. My son said he was sorry too. He said he should have come to me directly instead of letting it become what it became. He meant that part, I think. I could hear it. My son is not a bad person. He is a person who loves someone who is not good for him, and he has made that person's priorities his own. And that is a very common and very painful thing to watch happen to someone you raised. I told them I appreciated them coming. I told my son his apology meant something to me. I told my daughter-in-law that I heard what she said. And then I said, I want to be honest with you both about where things stand. I told them about the insurance. I told them about the equipment loan, that I had spoken to the lender and handled the necessary paperwork. I told them about the account. I went through it clearly and without drama, the way I would brief a client on a project. My daughter-in-law's expression did not change. I will give her that. She has a remarkable capacity for stillness. My son's face went through about 6 different things. Surprise, then something that looked like calculation, then something that looked, for just a moment, like shame. He said, Dad, you didn't have to. I said, I know. I chose to. There was a long silence. My daughter-in-law said, Is this because of the conversation I had with you at the party? I said, It's because of everything. She said, Everything. I said, Yes. Another silence. The oak tree was visible through the back window. Still there. Still exactly where it had always been. She said very carefully, I think you're making decisions from a place of hurt rather than reason. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, The estate attorney I worked with has 40 years of experience. My financial advisor has been with me for 18. I'm comfortable with the quality of the reasoning. That was the end of that argument. They left about 40 minutes later. My son hugged me on the porch. It was tight, longer than usual. I held on. I did not cry until I was back inside. Not because I was sad about what I'd done. I knew what I'd done was right. I cried because I could feel, in that hug, the boy he used to be. The kid who came running in from the backyard to show me a turtle he'd found by the fence. The teenager who sat with me on that same porch the night his mother got her diagnosis and didn't say anything. Just sat there because he didn't know what to say. And neither did I, and somehow that was enough. That boy was still in there somewhere. He'd just gotten very lost. A month passed, then 6 weeks. My son texted a few times, short messages checking in. I responded. I was not cruel. I was not cruel. I was just measured, in a way I had perhaps not been for most of his adult life. He was 34 years old. He had a good job. He had a wife he had chosen. He was going to have to figure out who he was in relation to all of that. I couldn't do it for him. My daughter-in-law did not contact me directly, which she did, and I found this out through my son, who told me more than he probably should have in one of his check-in calls, was start asking questions about the estate changes. She wanted to know, he said, if the attorney changes were final, if there was a will, what was in it. My son, to his credit, told me this directly. He said, I felt like you should know. I said, thank you. He said, Dad, I don't know what to do. I said, I know. He said, I love her. I said, I love her. I said, I know that too. I said, here's what I can tell you. I will always be your father. That's not changing. But I am also a person, with a home I built and a life I built, and I will not be managed out of either one of them, not by anyone. And if the woman you married cannot accept that, then the two of you are going to have to decide what that means. He didn't say anything. I said, that's not an ultimatum. That's just the truth. 2 weeks after that conversation, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up on the third ring. It was a woman. She introduced herself as my daughter-in-law's mother. I had met her once, briefly, at the wedding. A sharp woman. Smart. I remembered thinking at the time that the apple hadn't fallen far. She said she hoped I didn't mind her calling. She said she'd gotten my number from her daughter. I said that was fine. She said she had been made aware of some of the recent family situation, and she wanted me to know that she did not condone her daughter's behavior. That she had raised her daughter to have more respect than that, and she was embarrassed, and she was sorry. I was quiet for a moment. She said, I know an apology from me doesn't fix anything. I just thought you deserved to hear it. I said, I appreciate that more than you know. She asked how I was. I told her I was all right. I told her I was back in the garden, which I had neglected for a while. She said her husband had been a gardener. I said mine too. That my wife had kept the beds along the side of the house, and I had finally learned the names of what she planted. 4 years too late. We talked for 20 minutes. It was the most straightforward conversation I'd had with anyone connected to that situation since it began. When we hung up, I sat in my study for a while. In the room where all of this had started, where I had stood with a woman who saw my home as an asset and my age as an opportunity. I thought about how much had changed in just a few months, how much had been stripped away, and how much had, underneath that stripping, remained. The house was still mine. Every room, every corner, every corner, every corner of every corner of every corner. My son was still my son, still finding his way, still capable, I had to believe, of being better. And I was still here. 63 years old, retired, sitting in my study surrounded by the work of a lifetime, with a garden to tend and an oak tree in the backyard that was not going anywhere. No one was transitioning anything. The only thing I was moving into was whatever came next, on my own terms, at my own pace, in my own home. I uncapped my pen and went back to the notes I'd been making, a project I'd been putting off for years, hand drafting a detailed plan of the property. Every measurement, every element, the way I would have done professionally 30 years ago. For the record, for my own satisfaction. Because some things you build belong to you, not because of a deed or a document, but because you put your hands on every part of them. And some things, no matter who comes along with their assessments and their plans and their careful measured words, do not get taken away. I have been thinking a lot lately about what we pass down without meaning to. Not money, not property. The other things, the patterns, the tolerance for being treated a certain way, the habit of writing checks and asking nothing in return and calling it love when really, if you're honest, some of it was just easier than the conversation you didn't want to have. I'm not saying I was a bad father. I don't believe that. But I was, for a long time, a father who confused generosity with relationship. I gave, and somewhere in that giving I stopped paying attention to what was growing on the other side of it. My son grew up understanding that if he waited long enough, things would work out, that discomfort was temporary. That someone would smooth it over. I was that someone, more times than I can count. And I did it because I loved him. But I also did it because it felt good to be needed. And that's the part I have to be honest about. What happened at that retirement party didn't come from nowhere. My daughter-in-law didn't walk into my study and lay out a real estate assessment because she woke up that morning and decided to be cruel. She walked in because everything she had observed about the dynamic in that family told her it was worth trying. That requests got met. That boundaries weren't enforced. That the path of least resistance ran straight through me. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't care about your intentions. You could do something from love for 30 years and still end up at the end of it, having taught exactly the wrong lesson. I taught my son that there were no real consequences. My daughter-in-law learned that from him before she ever met me. What changed everything, and I mean this, was not the anger. I felt anger, yes, in that study. And I felt it again in that diner booth watching my son look out the window instead of at me. But anger by itself has never built anything I'm proud of. What changed things was clarity. The moment I stopped trying to understand what my daughter-in-law's intentions were and started paying attention to what her actions actually showed me. The moment I stopped giving my son credit for who I hoped he was becoming and started responding to who he was showing up as. That's the discipline nobody talks about. Not the confrontation, not the financial decisions, not the attorney's office. The discipline of seeing clearly without softening what you see to protect yourself from what it means. My son is still my son. I believe he will find his way. But I cannot find it for him. I couldn't 30 years ago, and I can't now. The most honest thing a parent can do, eventually, is stop standing between their child and the weight of their own choices. The oak tree is still in the backyard. I had coffee out there this morning. The garden alongside of the house is coming back. Slowly. The way things come back when you finally pay them proper attention. I built this house with my hands and my wife's vision and 30 years of work. No one is transitioning me out of it, not with assessments, not with careful words, not with concern dressed up as strategy. I am 63 years old, and I know who I am. That, in the end, is the only thing that was ever worth holding on to.